Good evening. If you would go ahead and get out your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 is where we will be. We've been working on this series going through Hebrews 11 and looking at the different examples of faith that we have there. And tonight we're going to be talking about Joseph. But after tonight we're going to take a little bit of a break because the next person we're going to be talking about is Moses. And I figured that the Israelites had to wait 430 years before they left Egypt, so why not make you wait a little while? Kidding. But Moses has a lot said about him, and I want to make sure that I do that right. But also, in a series that is, kind of long and drawn out like this, it's good to take breaks. Might get bogged down, might get weary of studying the same thing every Sunday night. So we're going to take a little bit of a break. But when we come back, we will talk about Moses, and we'll talk about everything else, and we will finish Hebrews 11 after all of that. But I kind of want to make a game plan for that and treat it the way that it should be treated. So that's part of the reason for the break as well. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 22, it says, "By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones." I've thought about Hebrews 11 lately, and especially this section where you're talking about the patriarchs. And it's interesting what the author of Hebrews 11 highlights, because when you talk about somebody like Jacob, there's other things he could have highlighted, other episodes of faith, and we did talk about that a little bit. With Joseph, there's definitely, we'll call it episodes of faith that Joseph had, and the writer of Hebrews does not mention those things. And we are going to talk about that tonight, kind of how Joseph got to the point that is talked about tonight, where he gave orders concerning his bones. But I've been thinking about why. Why would the Hebrew author only highlight these things? My guess is it has to do with verse 16, where he says, "But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." Because what the Hebrew author then highlights is how Jacob and Joseph and even Isaac to some extent talk about the things that are promised to them, how they're looking ahead to the promises, and specifically looking ahead to that promised land that was promised to them. And yes, I know they made predictions concerning the physical promised land, but I think perhaps what is happening is the author of Hebrews is making a connection with them looking to the physical promised land and how we should be looking for the heavenly promised land, that the better country, that heavenly one, because God has prepared a city for us. Just something to think about as we get into Joseph tonight. But as we talk about Joseph, we want to talk about Joseph's faith. And yes, he showed his faith when he gave orders concerning his bones, but we want to talk about how he got to that point as well. How Joseph got to that point where he was giving orders concerning his bones when he died. And if you would turn to Genesis 37, we're not going to read the whole story of Joseph tonight. We're only going to highlight a few passages here and there. But I want you to see, as we look along, that Joseph's faith didn't waver. At least that's from what we can tell from what the biblical narrative shows us. All this time, Joseph's trust in God, his faith did not waver, even through all the things that he went through. In Genesis 37, in verse 1, it says, "Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed to my sheaf." Then his brother said to him, "Are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, "Lo, I've had still another dream. Behold, the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So as Joseph has had these dreams, he sees that he's able to kind of see what the dreams mean, at least to some point. Even Jacob's able to see it, that I've got a sheaf and my brothers have sheaves and their sheaves are bowing down to mine. Or as I'm standing in the sky, the sun and moon and 11 stars are bowing down to me. And he sees that, and he's talking about how amazing it is. And we don't know Joseph's motives for that. He is relatively young. There might have been an element of pride in that. We don't know. But at the same time, I think, this is something for him to think about and something that he is pondering. And maybe you can see, perhaps he has the idea that this is something God is showing him, promising to him. And he's excited about that. Whatever Joseph's motives here are not clear, but as we go along in Genesis 39, we start to see the kind of man that Joseph is. In Genesis 39, after his brothers have taken him, thrown him in a pit, they were going to kill him, but Judah convinced them to sell him instead and lie to Jacob about him being dead. So he sold them to slavery in Egypt. And in verse 1 of chapter 39, it says, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord had caused all that he had to prosper in his hand." And then if you go down to verse 21, even after Potiphar has exalted him in his household, but then of course he is falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown into prison. In verse 21, when he's thrown into jail, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made prosper." So multiple times in this chapter does it say that the Lord was with him, the Lord was with Joseph. And yes, I think that in part is because Joseph has been downtrodden. Yes, it's in part because of God's plan, but ultimately, the Lord is with Joseph because Joseph is a man of faith. Because Joseph is a man who clings to God and trusts in him and does what is right and what he has commanded, no matter what personal things happen to him. I mean, he could have not held to his integrity with Potiphar's wife, and he could have very easily said, we'll get away with it, nobody will know, it'll just be between me and his wife, and that's it. But that's not what he said. And he didn't just say that because of his master's sake, but he ultimately said that because of the Lord's sake. It would be wrong to do it before the Lord. Could not do that thing to the Lord. And so Joseph is a man of integrity, a man of faith, even as he's going through these difficult times, even as he's thrown in prison, as he's enslaved unjustly, all of that. And of course, and then in chapters 40 through 44, we learn about Joseph's rise to power, how he's interpreting dreams while he's in prison. He's left for 2 years, but then Pharaoh has a dream, and Pharaoh's servant hears about how Joseph can interpret dreams, and then Joseph interprets a dream, and he trusts what God has given him. He trusts that God has given them the right interpretation, and he gives advice on this, and so Joseph is made ruler of Egypt. And then a time goes by, and Joseph sees his brothers. They come to Egypt for food because everywhere in the world is under famine. But as Joseph is going through this charade with his brothers, they don't know who he is, but he knows them. And he does play some kind of game with them where, he says, "You're spies," and bring back Benjamin. And we don't know his motives with all of that. But something shifts with Joseph, and he sees the full picture. And in Genesis 45, what we read just a moment ago, Genesis 45, then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they came closer. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve you for a remnant in the earth, to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his household, and ruler of all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father, and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will also provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come, and you and your household and all that you have would be impoverished." So Joseph says, I see the picture here. God has sent me before you into Egypt. He sent me to preserve life. There is going to be a famine in the land, and you people would have starved. Our family would have died. But I'm going to help. I'm going to protect you. God has done this for you and for us. But one thing that I've wrestled with in this is, well, God could have just made it so there wouldn't have been a famine in the first place. God could have made it so that he just blessed the house of Jacob. And even if there was a famine in all the land, God could have just blessed Jacob's harvest and kept him safe. That would have been one way to solve it. But there's more to it than that, right? This is all part of God's grand scheme. Going all the way back to Genesis 15, where he told Abraham that your descendants would be slaves in a foreign land. And after 400 years, they would come out and take this land. How much of that did Joseph know here? At this point in time, we don't know. We don't know if Joseph is factoring that in, but he sees God's hand in this. He is confident that God has made all this happen. And he has faith in God that that's what God is doing, that God is protecting Jacob, protecting the family. So his cognizance of these promises, he may not have the full story yet, but he understands that at the very least that God is going to protect Jacob. God is going to protect that family because of the promises that God has made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But then when we come to Genesis 50, what you could call his last act of faith, at the very least, by the time of Genesis 50, when he's dying, he's put it all together. God didn't just send them into Egypt to preserve life, and they were going to stay in Egypt indefinitely. But Joseph understood that God was going to take them back out, and that they were going to take the land of promise, that they were going to live in the land of promise as had been promised. In Genesis 15 verse 22 it says, "Now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons, and also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt." Joseph brought his family down to Egypt. But at least at this point, and I would argue probably even as he was bringing them down, he understood that that's not where they were going to stay. That God was going to bring them there, but there would be a time when they would leave. When they would go back to the land of promise and dwell in that land as God had promised. Whether he knew about Genesis 15 and that promise made to Abraham about how your descendants would be slaves in a land and after 400 years they would come out, whether he knew about that, we just don't know. Was that passed down from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph? We don't know. But he knew enough about God's promises, what had been passed down through that family. He knew that they were going to go back. That's what God had promised. And even though they were in Egypt, even though they were thriving, even though it took 400 years before they started to really even see trouble in the land of Egypt, about 400 years, Joseph knew what God had said, and he put his trust in it. And he made his descendants, his brothers, swear that they were going to take his bones out, that he did not want his remains to dwell in Egypt, but rather when they entered into the land of Israel, that he would be buried there. Because that was where his people were going to dwell. I love what Joseph says in verse 25. He says, God will surely take care of you. If anybody knew that, it would be Joseph. If anybody knew God will surely take care of you, it would be Joseph. Sold into slavery, accused of, at the very least, attempted adultery, thrown into prison, forgotten for 2 years, and yet risen to power, second in command at the top of Egypt, was reunited with his father. It says earlier that when Joseph had his children, that God had made him to forget all his affliction from his father's house. But he was reunited with his father, reconciled with his brothers. He prospered. He was taken care of. If anyone knew that God would surely take care of them, it would be Joseph, because God surely took care of him. And God took care of him. God caused him to prosper. The Lord was with him because he was a man of faith. Because he was committed to doing whatever the Lord said. He was committed to the word of the Lord no matter what happened to him. You know, he saw what God had brought about. That they would need to come and live in Egypt so he could protect them. That he could provide for them. But he still believed in the original plan. He knew what God had promised, and he knew that God wasn't going to sway from that. And that's much like his own life. He knew what God had promised, but things for a time did not go according to plan. But eventually they did. For the Israelites, as they dwell in the land of Egypt for all those years, and then they undergo bondage. They're in slavery. And Pharaoh is killing their children, as we'll talk about when we get to talking about Moses. Things were not going according to plan. But God still delivered on His promises. For us, wherever we are in our lives right now, things may not be going according to plan. Things may not be going perfectly for us. We may have difficulties. We may have sickness. We may have pain. We may have loved ones who have died. We may have, job issues or whatever kind of stress, whatever kind of pain, whatever kind of persecution we can have in this life. That may be us right now. Things may not be going exactly according to plan. But like Joseph, we still need to believe in the original plan. We still need to believe that God is going to see us through it. God will surely take care of us if we are faithful to Him. If we put our trust in Him, He's going to take care of us. So as we close this evening, I want you to think about where you stand with God. And I want you to think about, do you truly put your trust in Him? Do you truly believe that no matter where you are right now, that God is going to take care of you as long as you are faithful to Him? If you haven't obeyed the gospel, you have not put your trust in Jesus. You have not put your trust in God. But you can this evening. Believing in Jesus, repenting of your sins, confessing Jesus before men, being baptized for the remission of sins. You put your trust in Jesus. And you dedicate your life to Him. If you have put on Christ in baptism, but perhaps you have wavered from serving Him with your utmost, serving Him with your whole heart, this is a time to rededicate yourself. When we sing this invitation song, you'll have a chance to come forward, confess any sins that you've made, ask for the prayers of the saints, and we'd be happy to help you in any way that we can. We're all trying to get to heaven. We're all trying to serve our Lord. And so let's focus on putting our trust in the Lord. No matter what happens to us, we put our trust in Him, that He will surely take care of us. If you have any need this evening, won't you come while we stand and sing?